October 1982. 9-year-old Keisha Williamson's school bus pulled up at Elm Street, as always. Yet instead of her mother's waiting arms, a dark green sedan lurked in the shadows. No one sounded the alarm. 15 years later, the bus driver finally breaks his silence and reveals the secret he's carried in fear. Welcome to Minority Struggles. Wherever you're listening, this is where unheard stories are being told. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments what times and where you're tuning in from. It means everything to know we're telling these stories together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. From his driver's seat, Mr. Otis D. Miller, a man whose 48 years were etched into a face as familiar to these children as their own school teachers, watched Keisha in his oversized rear-view mirror. She was a quiet one, that Williamson girl, always with her nose in a book, her neatly plaited hair with its bright yellow beads a small spot of sunshine in the often boisterous bus. He navigated the route through the predominantly black working-class neighborhood with practiced ease, the route a map imprinted on his mind from over a decade of service. But today, an unfamiliar edginess prickled beneath his usual stoicism, a restlessness in the air, a feeling that the ordinary rhythm of the afternoon was somehow subtly off-key. He noticed it earlier, a tension in the way cars cut each other off downtown, a certain hurried, furtive quality to some of the faces he'd passed. He tried to dismiss it as just one of those days. The bus groaned to a halt at the corner of Elm and 3rd, a stop shaded by a sprawling, ancient oak tree whose leaves were now a riot of crimson and gold. Elm Street, Mr. Miller called out, his voice the usual gravelly monotone that carried easily over the chatter of the remaining children. Keisha looked up, her eyes momentarily unfocused as she returned from her literary adventure. Offering him a small, shy smile and a murmured, "Thank you, Mr. Miller," she carefully placed her library book in her canvas school bag, gathered her things, and stepped down onto the familiar cracked sidewalk. A few other children disembarked with her, their voices briefly rising in a flurry of weekend excitement before they scattered towards their respective homes. As Keisha turned, adjusting the strap of her bag on her shoulder, and began her short walk down Elm Street, Mr. Miller's gaze idly followed her small figure. It was a habit, a silent counting of heads, ensuring each child was safely on their way. It was then, in that fleeting moment of observation, that he saw it. Parked about halfway down the block on the opposite side of the street, partially concealed by the deep afternoon shadows beneath another large oak, was an unfamiliar car. It was a dark green sedan, an older model from the 70s, maybe a Ford LTD or a Mercury Marquis. Its paint dull, its chrome pitted. It wasn't the car itself that snagged his attention so much as its stillness, the way it seemed to be deliberately waiting, out of place on this quiet residential street where everyone knew everyone else's vehicles. He could make out a figure in the driver's seat, little more than a silhouette, but he noted the distinct shape of a fedora hat pulled low, obscuring the face. As Keisha, engrossed in her own world, perhaps already replaying scenes from Narnia in her mind, walked past the point where the car was parked, Mr. Miller saw the driver's head turn slowly, unmistakably following her progress. A sharp, cold barb of unease pierced through Mr. Miller's weariness. This wasn't right. He knew the families on this street. That car, that watching figure felt wrong, predatory. For a fraction of a second, he considered honking the horn, calling out to Keisha, doing something. But then what? Accuse a parked man of what? Looking? The children still on his bus were getting restless. He had a schedule to keep. He was just a bus driver. His own fear, a sudden, unwelcome tightening in his chest, whispered caution. It was probably nothing, he told himself, just someone visiting or lost. He was tired, imagining things. He pulled the lever, the bus doors hissing shut with a decisive pneumatic sigh. He engaged the gears, the heavy vehicle groaning as it pulled away from the curb. In his rearview mirror, he caught one last glimpse of Keisha, a small, solitary figure turning onto the walkway of her own house a few doors down from the parked green car. Then she was out of sight. The car remained. The image of that dark green sedan and the shadowed figure in the fedora, however, did not leave him as easily as he left Elm Street. It replayed in his mind at the next stop, and the next, a small, nagging burr of anxiety. Meanwhile, inside the small, meticulously kept house at 217 Elm Street, Sharon Williamson, Keisha's devoted single mother, glanced at the kitchen clock. 4:15. Keisha, usually home like clockwork by 4:10, was a few minutes late. Sharon, 30 years old, with a warm smile and eyes that held both a fierce love for her daughter and the quiet weariness of a woman working 2 jobs to keep them afloat, continued to stir the chicken and dumplings simmering on the stove. The aroma, rich with herbs and the promise of a comforting meal, filled the small kitchen. "Probably dawdling with Janie again," she murmured, thinking of Keisha's best friend who lived 2 streets over. But when 4:30 arrived, and then 4:45, and the familiar sound of Keisha's key in the lock and her cheerful "Mama, I'm home," didn't materialize, the slight maternal concern sharpened into a distinct, pointed worry. Keisha was a responsible child, not one to stray without permission. Sharon wiped her hands on her apron, a growing unease unfurling within her. She stepped onto the small front porch, her gaze sweeping up and down Elm Street. The street was quiet, awash in the lengthening shadows of the late afternoon. Most of the other children were already inside, the sounds of their play replaced by the muffled cadence of televisions. No sign of Keisha. "Keisha," Sharon called out, her voice a little louder than she intended, a tremor of anxiety already lacing it. Only the rustle of dry leaves answered. She hurried back inside, her heart beginning to pick up its pace. She dialed Janie's number. Mrs. Thompson answered, friendly and calm, but confirmed Keisha hadn't been there. Janie had come straight home and was doing her homework. A cold knot began to form in Sharon's stomach. She called 2 more of Keisha's friends' mothers. Each call yielded the same negative response, each denial tightening the knot of fear. The chicken and dumplings on the stove were forgotten, their comforting aroma now a sickening counterpoint to the terror blooming in Sharon's chest. She grabbed her purse and keys, her movements quick and jerky. Stepping back out onto the porch, she scanned the street again, her eyes desperate. The green sedan Mr. Miller had fleetingly noticed was long gone, or perhaps had never been more than a figment of his own tired imagination. A detail he would not consciously recall or connect for another 15 agonizing years. For Sharon Williamson, standing on her porch as the sky began to bruise towards evening, there was only the vast, terrifying emptiness of a street where her daughter should have been, and the dawning, soul-shattering realization that Keisha, her Keisha, was truly, inexplicably missing. The setting sun bled crimson and violet across the October sky, casting long, mournful shadows down Elm Street as Sharon Williamson's initial, frantic calls confirmed the unthinkable. No one had seen Keisha since she'd stepped off Mr. Miller's school bus. The comforting aroma of chicken and dumplings, now cold and forgotten on the stove, seemed to mock the icy dread that had seized Sharon's heart. Her 9-year-old daughter, her quiet, book-loving Keisha, was not just late, she was missing. Panic, sharp and clawing, propelled Sharon out the door. She ran from neighbor to neighbor, her voice cracking as she called Keisha's name, her eyes desperately scanning backyards, behind bushes, any small space where a child might hide or play. A few neighbors, their faces etched with concern, joined her, their calls echoing hers in the rapidly falling dusk. The familiar, friendly street transformed into a labyrinth of terrifying possibilities. Had she fallen? Been lured away? Taken? Each thought was a fresh stab of agony. By the time full darkness enveloped Harmony Grove, a small, anxious crowd had gathered outside Sharon's house. Neighbors, friends from church, a few of Keisha's bewildered schoolmates clinging to their parents. Someone had called the Harmony Grove Police Precinct. 2 uniformed officers, their expressions a mixture of professional concern and a weary sort of resignation common to those who frequently witnessed the sharper edges of life, arrived in a cruiser. Sharon, trembling but articulate through her fear, recounted Keisha's routine, her punctuality, her sensible nature. "She wouldn't just wander off, officer," Sharon insisted, her voice tight with unshed tears. "She knows to come straight home. Something has happened to her. Something terrible." The officers took notes, their questions standard methodical. Had there been any family trouble? Any strangers seen in the neighborhood? Any reason Keisha might run away? The last question felt like a physical blow to Sharon. "Run away?" she repeated, incredulous. "She's 9 years old. She's a happy child. She had a spelling test to study for, a library book she was halfway through. She wouldn't run away." The minority struggles, undercurrent, often unspoken but deeply felt in communities like Harmony Grove, began to surface in the subtle ways the officers' questions seemed to probe for internal fault rather than external threat. Yet, they were not unkind, just procedural. They promised to put out an alert, to have patrols sweep the area. The next morning, the formal investigation began. Detectives interviewed Sharon again, their questions more detailed. They spoke to Keisha's teacher, her friends, and they interviewed Mr. Otis Miller, the school bus driver. Mr. Miller sat in the small interview room at the precinct, his large hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was a man unaccustomed to such scrutiny, his life one of quiet routines and unspoken observations. He recounted Keisha's departure from the bus, just as he had countless other children that day. "Yes, sir," he told the detective, a younger, sharper man than the beat cops from the night before. "Keisha Williamson got off at Elm and 3rd like always. Walked off towards her house. Seemed fine." The image of the dark green sedan, the man in the fedora watching Keisha, flashed in Mr. Miller's mind with sickening clarity. His heart hammered. He'd barely slept, that image playing on a loop, his initial dismissal of it now feeling like a monumental, unforgivable error in judgment. He could feel the sweat prickle on his palms. But the man in that car, he had a look about him, a certain coldness that Miller recognized. It was the look of someone who wouldn't hesitate to silence a witness, especially a black bus driver from the Grove who nobody important would likely miss. Fear, potent and paralyzing, coiled in his gut. He thought his own quiet life, his small pension. What if they came after him? Who would believe him anyway against a man who might have connections? "Did you notice anything out of the ordinary, Mr. Miller?" the detective pressed. "Anything at all?" Otis Miller swallowed hard. The words, the truth, were right there, caught in his throat. But the fear was a heavier weight. "No, sir," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Just a regular afternoon. She got off the bus, and I drove on. That's all I saw." He hated himself for it, a deep, burning shame igniting within him. But the fear was a cold, smothering blanket. With Mr. Miller offering no new information, the police focused their efforts on a grid search of the neighborhood, then the woods bordering Harmony Grove. Volunteers from Zion Hope Community Church, organized by grief-stricken but determined Deacon Peterson, who remembered Reverend Thorne's disappearance under a similar cloud of official inaction years ago, fanned out, printing their own flyers with Keisha's gap-toothed school photo, their prayers a constant murmur against the tide of despair. Days bled into a week. No ransom note arrived. No credible witnesses came forward to say they'd seen Keisha after she walked away from the bus stop. The dark green sedan and its watching driver remained locked solely in Otis Miller's tormented memory. The police investigation, lacking any solid leads, began to lose momentum. Resources were shifted to newer, more pressing cases. Keisha Williamson's file, like so many others from neighborhoods like Harmony Grove, started to gather a metaphorical layer of dust. Sharon Williamson, however, did not stop. She walked the streets day after day, calling Keisha's name until her voice was raw. She sat by the phone, willing it to ring with news. She prayed with a ferocity that left her exhausted but unbowed. But as autumn deepened, turning the vibrant leaves to brittle brown, the silence surrounding her daughter's disappearance became a deafening, unbearable roar. Mr. Miller saw her sometimes, a gaunt figure walking the perimeter of the schoolyard, her eyes scanning every child, every passing car. Each sighting was a fresh twist of a knife in his gut. He started taking different routes home from his bus depot, avoiding Elm Street, avoiding the sight of Keisha's empty porch. The secret he carried was a living thing now, growing heavier with each passing day, its tendrils wrapping around his soul. He told himself he'd done what he had to do to stay safe, that no one would have believed him anyway. But in the quiet hours of the night, Keisha Williamson's shy smile and the glint of yellow beads in her hair haunted his dreams. The official search was quietly scaled back. Keisha became another face on a missing child poster, her story a brief, tragic headline that soon faded from the local news cycle. For Sharon Williamson, the nightmare had no end. For Otis Miller, it was just beginning. And for Keisha, there was only silence. The initial, frantic energy that had consumed Harmony Grove in the autumn of 1982, the desperate searches, the tearful prayer vigils, the hastily printed flyers bearing Keisha Williamson's gap-toothed smile, eventually, inevitably, began to wane. Hope, once a blazing fire in Sharon Williamson's heart, cooled to embers, then to a stubborn, resilient coal that glowed faintly in the darkness of her unending grief. For the wider world, and even for many in their own community, Keisha's disappearance gradually receded from daily consciousness, becoming a sad story, a cautionary tale whispered among parents, then a faded local memory. For Sharon, however, time did not heal. It merely stretched the wound, making the absence of her daughter a constant, defining feature of her existence. She kept Keisha's small bedroom exactly as it had been on that October afternoon. The worn copy of A Wrinkle in Time still on the nightstand, a collection of colorful beads in a small dish on the dresser, a half-finished drawing of a winged horse taped to the wall. Each year, on Keisha's birthday, Sharon would buy a small cake, light the candles, and sing happy birthday to an empty room, her voice thick with unshed tears. Her attempts to keep the police interested in the case became a lonely crusade. The initial detectives moved on or retired, replaced by new faces who offered polite sympathy, but had no personal connection to the yellowing file that bore Keisha's name. The minority struggles theme echoed in the quiet closing of doors, the unreturned phone calls, the subtle message that a missing black girl from a working-class neighborhood was, after a certain point, a lost cause not worth extensive, ongoing resources. Across town, Mr. Otis A.D. Miller lived with a different kind of haunting. The dark green sedan and the man in the fedora were seared into his memory, images that would surface unbidden in the quiet of the night, or when he saw a child with bright yellow beads in her hair. He'd aged in those 15 years, from a stoic man of 48 to a 63-year-old retiree whose shoulders seemed permanently stooped, not just by age, but by the invisible weight of his silence. His health had begun to falter. A persistent cough rattled his chest, and his hands, once so steady on the wheel of bus number 7, now trembled slightly. Fear had been a loyal, if unwelcome, companion. The man he'd seen that day, the one whose cold eyes had met his fleetingly, was a figure known in the shadowy corners of Harmony Grove and beyond. A man named Silas Sly Jackson, rumored to have connections that reached into places best left undisturbed. Miller had seen Sly around town over the years, a swaggering, confident presence whose occasional, passing glance felt like a cold reminder of what he knew and what he hadn't said. Each sighting reinforced Miller's conviction that speaking out in 1982 would have been a death sentence, or at least invited a ruin he couldn't afford. He told himself he was protecting his own quiet life, but the price was a conscience that festered like an untreated wound. He avoided Elm Street as if it were cursed. He sold his old television because even the cheerful jingles of children's programming felt like an accusation. Sometimes, usually after a particularly bad night, he would draft an anonymous letter to the police, his hand shaking so badly the words were almost illegible, only to tear it up in a fit of renewed terror and self-loathing. The secret was a cancer, eating away at him from the inside. The community of Harmony Grove, while never truly forgetting Keisha, learned to live with the void. New children were born, new families moved in. The flyers with Keisha's face eventually faded and tore from the telephone poles, replaced by newer notices for bake sales and town meetings. Only a few, like Sharon, and perhaps Deacon Peterson from Zion Hope, who still prayed for both Keisha and the long-lost Reverend Thorne for his own earlier tragedy, kept the flame of active memory alive. As the years passed, the investigation into Keisha's disappearance became thoroughly, unequivocally cold. The original case files were archived, moved from active investigations to the dusty shelves of unsolved crimes. When Sharon Williamson would make her annual call to the precinct around the anniversary of Keisha's disappearance, she'd often speak to a new detective, someone who would have to pull the old file, someone to whom Keisha was just a name, a statistic, another ghost in the system. By the early autumn of 1997, 15 years had etched themselves onto the faces and hearts of those who remembered. Sharon Williamson, now 45, still looked for Keisha in the face of every passing young woman. Her hope transformed into a quiet, enduring ache. Mr. Otis Miller, 63 and recently diagnosed with a serious heart condition, sat alone in his small, dim house, the October wind rattling his window panes. The proximity of his own mortality had brought his guilt into sharper, more unbearable focus. The image of 9-year-old Keisha, her bright yellow beads, her shy smile, and the dark green sedan waiting under the oak tree, played in his mind with a clarity that was both a torment and a summons. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he couldn't carry his secret to the grave. The weight was too heavy. The silence had lasted too long. He had to speak, whatever the cost. The time for fear was running out, eclipsed by the urgent, terrifying need for confession. The decision, once made, settled in Otis Miller's chest like a stone, heavy and permanent. For 15 years, the secret of what he'd seen on that October afternoon in 1982 had been his constant, corrosive companion. Now, at 63, with a hacking cough that stole his breath and a heart that beat like a trapped bird, the fear of dying with that silence intact had finally outweighed the fear of Silas Sly Jackson. The scales had tipped, not towards courage, perhaps, but towards an exhaustion so profound that even retribution seemed a lesser burden than another day of carrying his guilt. He dressed with trembling hands in his best, slightly frayed Sunday suit, the one he hadn't worn in years. The walk to the county police station in Harmony Grove felt like trudging through deep water, each step an effort. The autumn air, crisp and carrying the scent of wood smoke, did nothing to cool the feverish anxiety that burned within him. When he finally pushed open the heavy doors of the precinct, the mundane bustle of a weekday morning, phones ringing, officers chatting, the clatter of typewriters, seemed a world away from the turmoil in his soul. The desk sergeant, a young, clean-shaven man with an air of bored efficiency, looked up as Miller approached. "Help you." Otis Miller cleared his throat, the sound raspy. I need to speak to a detective," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "About an old case. A missing girl. From years ago." The sergeant raised an eyebrow. "Old case? How old?" 15 years, Miller said, the words feeling like they were being dragged from him. "Her name was Keisha Williamson." A flicker of something, recognition, pity, crossed the sergeant's face. "Williamson? Yeah, I think I've seen that file. Cold as ice. What about it?" "I have information," Miller stated, his voice gaining a sliver of resolve. "Something I should have said back then." He was eventually led to a small, windowless interview room and told to wait. The minutes stretched, each tick of the wall clock amplifying his trepidation. Finally, the door opened and a woman entered. She was in her late 30s or early 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, but there was a perceptible kindness in her expression as she introduced herself. "Mr. Miller, I'm Detective Carla Reeves. I understand you have some information about the Keisha Williamson case." Otis Miller nodded, his gaze fixed on the worn Formica tabletop. This was it. There was no turning back. He took a shaky breath. "Yes, ma'am. It was me. I was her bus driver that day. The last one to see her, likely besides him." Detective Reeves sat opposite him, her expression attentive, a pen poised over a fresh notepad. "Take your time, Mr. Miller. Tell me what you remember." And so, the story he had locked away for 15 years began to spill out, haltingly at first, then with a gathering, painful urgency. He described that October afternoon in 1982, Keisha getting off the bus on Elm Street, her shy smile. He described the dark green sedan parked under the oak tree, a detail he'd forced himself to forget. And then he described the man in the fedora. "It was Sly Jackson, ma'am," Miller said, his voice dropping, the name still carrying a chill for him, even after all these years. Silas Sly Jackson was a name whispered in Harmony Grove, a man known for his intimidating presence, his rumored connections to less savory elements in the wider county, a man people crossed the street to avoid. I saw him plain as day. He was watching Keisha. After she got a little ways down the street, he got out of his car, said something to her. She looked scared. Then he took her by the arm, gentle-like but firm, led her to his car. She got in. They drove off. Detective Reeves listened intently, her pen moving swiftly, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes sharpened with each new detail. "Mr. Miller," she asked, her voice calm but firm, "why are you telling us this now? After 15 years. Otis Miller's eyes welled up, shame and regret etched into every line on his face. "Fear, detective. Pure, simple fear. Sly Jackson. He's not a man you cross. Not then, not now. He had a way of looking at you, like he knew your deepest thoughts. I had my own life, quiet as it was. I told myself maybe Keisha knew him, maybe it was innocent. I lied to myself. I lied to the police when they asked me back then. I said I saw nothing." He drew a ragged breath. "But I'm an old man now, detective. My health ain't good. I can't meet my maker with this sin on my soul. That little girl, I see her face every night." The confession, once started, poured out of him. Every detail he could recall about Sly Jackson that day, the make and model of the car as best he remembered, the direction they'd headed. He spoke of the crushing guilt, the years of looking over his shoulder, the way the secret had poisoned his life. When he finally fell silent, exhausted and trembling, Detective Reeves leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, what you've told us is incredibly serious, and I understand it must have taken immense courage to come forward now." Her voice was professional, yet carried an undercurrent of understanding. "This changes everything for Keisha Williamson's case. We'll need a formal, signed statement from you, of course. And I need to be clear, there may be questions about why you didn't come forward sooner." "I know," Miller whispered, nodding. "I deserve whatever comes. I just want the truth to be out there for that little girl. For her mama." Detective Reeves stood. "We're going to reopen this case, Mr. Miller. Based on your information, we're going to find out what happened to Keisha Williamson and what Silas Jackson's role was in it." A new determination hardened her gaze. The file that had been cold as ice for 15 years now had a fresh, burning ember. The silence was finally broken. The weight of Otis Miller's confession settled upon Detective Carla Reeves like the dust that coated the 15-year-old file boxes she now found herself pulling from the cold case archives. Keisha Williamson, case hashtag 82-0347, a slim manila folder containing the faded hopes and bureaucratic dismissals of a young life vanished, was suddenly, shockingly, active again. The year was 1997, and the events of that crisp October afternoon in 1982 felt like an echo from another lifetime. Yet Miller's tearful, detailed account had breathed a chilling immediacy into the long-dormant tragedy. Reeves spread the contents of Keisha's original file across her desk. A few grainy photographs of the search area, brief witness statements, including Miller's original, unrevealing one. The missing person report with Keisha's smiling school picture paperclipped to the front, her gap-toothed grin a silent reproach to the years of inaction. There was no mention of a dark green sedan, no note of any particular interest in Silas Sly Jackson, whom Miller now claimed was the man behind Keisha's abduction. Jackson, Reeves knew by reputation even before she pulled his own substantial file, was a figure who cast a long, cold shadow over Harmony Grove's less reputable corners. A man perpetually rumored to be involved in everything from illegal gambling to intimidation, yet always slippery, always just beyond the law's firm grasp. He was older now, like Miller, but his capacity for menace, Reeves suspected, had likely not diminished with age. The original 1982 investigation, as she read through the sparse reports, felt perfunctory, almost designed to fail. The runaway theory had been floated early and often, despite Keisha's tender age. Resources allocated had been minimal. The minority struggles theme, though not explicitly named in the official jargon, was evident in the subtext of every hastily closed lead and every unpursued avenue. A missing black child from a working-class neighborhood had not, it seemed, warranted the same level of sustained investigative fury as some other cases from that era. Otis Miller's fear, Reeves realized, was not just of Sly Jackson, but of a system he likely believed wouldn't protect him if he, a simple bus driver, pointed a finger at a connected man. Her first, most difficult task was to inform Sharon Williamson. Reeves found her still living in the same small house on Elm Street, a house kept with a heartbreaking neatness. Keisha's presence still palpable in the small, carefully preserved childhood drawings taped to the refrigerator. Sharon, now 45, had a resilience etched into the lines around her eyes, but also a profound weariness, the look of a woman who had carried an impossible burden for too long. When Detective Reeves gently explained that new information had come to light, a credible witness after all these years, Sharon listened in stunned silence, her hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles were white. The news that Otis Miller, a man she'd seen countless times over the years, a man who had driven her daughter's bus, had seen something and said nothing for 15 years, brought a fresh wave of agony. 15 years, she whispered, her voice a raw mix of anguish and a dawning, furious hope. He saw something, and he let me live like this, not knowing. Reeves allowed Sharon her anger, her grief. Then, she focused on the lead. Mr. Miller has identified the man he saw with Keisha, Mrs. Williamson, a man named Silas Jackson. Does that name mean anything to you? Sharon's eyes widened slightly. Sly Jackson? Everyone knew to stay clear of him. But Keisha, why would he? The question hung in the air, too terrible to fully articulate. The investigation into Sly Jackson began with cautious discretion. He was now in his late 50s, still living in the county, his legitimate businesses a string of bars and a bail bonds office, widely suspected to be fronts for less savory enterprises. Detective Reeves and her small team started by digging into his past, specifically around 1982. Did he own a dark green Ford or Mercury then? The DMV records from that era were archaic, paper-based, but they began the laborious search. Were there any other reports, any whispers connecting Jackson to children, or to violent acts that were never proven? It was like chasing a ghost through a 15-year fog. Potential witnesses from 1982 had moved, died, or their memories had faded into unreliable wisps. The specific dark green sedan Miller described was a common enough model. Proving Jackson owned that particular one, or had access to it on that specific day, seemed an almost insurmountable task without further corroboration. Detective Reeves brought Otis Miller back in several times, gently guiding him through his memories, trying to unearth any further details he might have suppressed. He described Sly Jackson's confident, predatory air that day, the way Keisha had looked small and frightened beside him. He remembered a bumper sticker on the sedan, something with a snarling animal, but the details were hazy. Each session left Miller drained, but a little lighter, the poison of his secret slowly being drawn out. Reeves knew Miller's uncorroborated eyewitness testimony, 15 years delayed, would be savaged by any defense attorney. She needed more. She needed something to tie Sly Jackson directly to Keisha, or to that green car, or to that specific day in October 1982. The team pored over old evidence logs, hoping something from Jackson's known associates or past activities might yield a link. They revisited the original, sparse witness list from Keisha's case, hoping someone might remember something new now that a specific name and vehicle description were in play. It was painstaking, often frustrating work, the passage of time their greatest adversary. Yet, Detective Reeves felt a growing conviction. Otis Miller's confession, for all its lateness, rang true. The fear he still exhibited when speaking Jackson's name was palpable. The details he provided, though old, were specific enough to warrant this deep dive. Somewhere in the buried layers of the past 15 years, she believed, lay the truth of what happened to Keisha Williamson. The secret had been unearthed. Now the challenge was to bring it fully into the light and find a measure of justice, however delayed. The hunt for evidence against Silas Jackson, a ghost from Harmony Grove's shadowed past, was officially on. The reopening of Keisha Williamson's case sent a tremor through the quiet corridors of the Harmony Grove police precinct. But out in the wider world, it was initially just another cold file dusted off. For Detective Carla Reeves, however, it became an obsession. Armed with Otis Miller's 15-year-old testimony, she began the painstaking process of trying to reconstruct a day from the distant past and build a case against Silas Sly Jackson, a man who had, for decades, operated with a chilling aura of untouchability. Jackson, now in his late 50s, had cultivated a veneer of semi-legitimacy over the years. His known businesses, a couple of dimly lit bars on the county line and a bail bonds office that always seemed to have more clients than it should, were rumored to be the acceptable face of a far less savory enterprise. He was still a man people spoke of in hushed tones, his influence a quiet undercurrent in the town's less visible power structures. Reeves's team delved into Jackson's history. Financial records from 1982 were almost non-existent for his suspected activities. He'd had a string of associates back then, some dead, some moved away, others still loyal or too terrified to speak even now. They meticulously searched old DMV records for a dark green Ford or Mercury sedan linked to Jackson or his known contacts around 1982. They found 3 possibilities, but no definitive link without further evidence. The bumper sticker with a snarling animal that Miller vaguely recalled was too generic a detail to narrow it down significantly. The original 1982 case file for Kesha was painfully thin. It documented Sharon Williamson's desperate pleas, the cursory neighborhood canvass, and Mr. Miller's original, anemic statement. There was a note about checking local junkyards for abandoned cars matching vague descriptions, all yielding nothing. The prevailing official sentiment, thinly veiled in the typed reports, was that the child had likely been taken by an opportunistic drifter, or had simply run away and met with misfortune far from home. Theories that required little follow-up and conveniently absolved local authorities of deeper responsibility. Detective Reeves brought Otis Miller in again, this time with a forensic sketch artist. Miller, though frail, focused intently, tried to recall more about the car, the man, the precise sequence of events. Under Reeves' patient, empathetic questioning, a new detail surfaced, one buried under layers of fear and time. The road, Miller said, his eyes distant. After Jackson's car pulled away with Kesha, it didn't head toward the main highway out of town. It turned off down that old logging track, the one that leads up to Blackwood Creek by the abandoned Jepson farm. It was a small detail, but it was new. The Jepson farm was a derelict property deep in the woods, miles from Kesha's bus stop, largely forgotten since Old Man Jepson had died in the early 70s. Jackson was known to have sometimes used the area for hunting parties back in the day, a euphemism many suspected covered less innocent gatherings. Armed with this, Detective Reeves secured a warrant to search the overgrown, dilapidated Jepson farmstead. The main house was a collapsing ruin, but behind it, half hidden by a thicket of thorny bushes, was an old, stone-lined well, its wooden cover rotted and askew. The air around it was heavy, still. The search was grim. Crime scene technicians, assisted by the local fire department's confined space rescue unit, began the arduous task of examining the well. After hours of carefully removing debris and pumping out stagnant water, they found what they had all begun to dread. First, a small, sodden canvas sneaker, the kind a 9-year-old girl might wear. Then, deeper in the silt and muck, the undeniable, heartbreaking discovery. The small, fragile remains of Keisha Williamson. Tucked beside her, preserved in the anaerobic mud, was a single bright yellow plastic bead. The news reached Sharon Williamson like a physical blow, a confirmation of her deepest fear, yet also, paradoxically, a release from the agonizing torture of not knowing. The where had finally been answered. Her daughter had been found. The grief was immense, a fresh wave that threatened to drown her, but within it a new, fierce resolve took root. Justice for Keisha. With Keisha's remains recovered from a property Sly Jackson was known to frequent in that era, and Otis Miller's eyewitness testimony placing him with Keisha on the day she vanished, the case against Jackson solidified. He was arrested, a move that sent ripples of shock and disbelief through those who thought him untouchable. Now in his late 50s, his swagger was gone, replaced by a sullen denial when Detective Reeves finally confronted him. The trial, when it eventually happened, was a local sensation. Otis Miller, frail but resolute, took the stand, his voice sometimes faltering but his account unwavering. He faced the consequences of his long silence. A lesser charge of obstruction, a suspended sentence given his age, health, and eventual cooperation. For him, the public confession and the role he played in finally bringing the truth to light was its own form of penance, a fragile peace found at the end of a tormented life. He passed away less than a year after the trial. Sly Jackson, faced with Miller's testimony and the forensic evidence linking Keisha to the Jepson farm he often used, was found guilty. The specific details of Keisha's final moments remained locked away with him, but the verdict brought a measure of justice. For Sharon Williamson, the journey was far from over. She buried Keisha in the Harmony Grove Cemetery, under a small, simple headstone that read, Keisha Williamson, beloved daughter, never forgotten. There was a profound sadness, but also a quiet dignity in finally being able to lay her child to rest. The truth, however horrific, was less cruel than the unending void of the unknown. Detective Carla Reeves closed the file on Keisha Williamson, one of the oldest cold cases she had ever reopened and solved. It was a somber victory, a testament to the fact that no secret, however long buried, is truly safe, and that sometimes, even after years of systemic neglect and fear-induced silence, a single voice, choosing courage late in life, can finally illuminate the darkest corners and bring a measure of delayed justice to those who have waited too long. The struggle had been real, the pain immense, but a small, vital truth had, at last, been unearthed.